Hello and welcome to Shift, a podcast on shifting paradigms of transformation. My name is Jonas Grüner and I hope you enjoy listening. Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Shift. Today I have the absolute privilege of talking to Jen Sandler. Jen is an anthropologist based in the United States, and her research focuses mostly on meetings and what meetings are, what they're good for, how good meetings happen, how bad meetings happen, what are the conditions that make a good meeting, what are some principles that can be applied, and what the role of meetings for social change is, and how to be more effective in that. We talk about all these things, and Jen's also very active as a community organizer, training students in community organizing, and is also part of a independent training collective where they run workshops on meetings and community organizing and a lot of different relational skills that are necessary to be in relationship in a way that allows for social change. I'm really excited about this conversation. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and I hope you enjoy it. Before we jump into it, I just wanted to quickly mention that I have some workshops coming up in August and September. One is about clarifying personal intentions for social change work and gaining some power out of that, learning the skill of shifting into your strong intentions. And the second one is about collective resilience and how to start modeling collective resilience as a radical practice for social change. Both of these workshops are free. You can find more information about them on my website. There's a link in the show notes to them, and I'd be happy to see you there. And I'd be even more happy if you bring your friends and activist colleagues. And yeah, that's it for now. And let's jump right into the episode. Hello and welcome back to Shift. Today I have the big honor to be here with Jen Sandler. Welcome, Jen. Thanks for being here and taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And maybe you can introduce yourself real quick, because I'm sure you know better how to do that than I do.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Jen. I wear a couple of different. I have a couple of different roles. I'm a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the U.S. and in the Department of Anthropology, and I run a program there called the Umass Alliance for Community Transformation. And we focus on training students in community organizing and popular education or critical facilitation. And then I also am I'm a member of the Stoke Collective, which is a training collective that focuses on relational culture and helping people to do their work, do social change work more sustainably, more joyfully, more effectively. Yeah, and I'm really happy to be here.
Cool. Sounds like these two things go together fairly well. These two different hats. Yeah, so we met a month ago, more than a month ago at this point, in Belgium at the Micro Solidarity Gathering, like the last guest I had on this podcast as well, Pascal, who you also know. And
Great. Yeah.
you ran a very interesting open space session on meetings during the course of that week, and yeah, some very great insights fell out of that for me, and I was wondering if you could just give us like the gist of why you're so excited about meetings, because that's the thing that I most took away from that, is like, oh yeah, meetings are really exciting and important. And yeah, I was wondering if you could just recap that really quick.
Sure. Well, I came to think about meetings as as an ethnographer. I was for my dissertation fieldwork in 2005 to 2008. I one of the things that I did was work with a coalition and a network, and a sort of large municipal coalition. And I was trying to figure out how to analyze all of this ethnographic field data, basically just notes
Mm,
and interviews, but largely field notes from spending 6 months intensively and several other visits to this to work with this coalition, and and the coalition has hundreds of people who are engaged really
mm,
actively in making it happen in a bunch of different sites all around the city. Really different roles that they each play, different relationships of power, and um, and I realized that all of my data was from meetings. I just went from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting all day long, every day. Um, and that anthropologists often, when they're talking about social change, you know, people who are talking about movements in particular, and activism, um, they must be in meetings all the time, but they are rarely talking about the meetings
mm,
explicitly. Like, what is a meeting? Like, literally, what is this thing called meeting that we do every day in order to make things happen? When those are the things that are happening, it's just more meetings, right? So that this, I started to think a lot about and attend to how do people talk about the role that meetings play in their work, in their social change work. People in organizational studies think about meetings more explicitly all the time, but in more activist spaces, in spaces where what we're trying to change is not an organization but the world,
mm.
right, or the way that power works, um, or who wields power, and who has rights and dignity in the world. Um, Meetings seem like this sort of banal thing that we have to do in order to do our work. And I think that's a sort of taken for granted. So it's a sort of ultimate sort of taken for granted thing that we do every day, but we kind of don't talk about the thing itself. So I started thinking about the thing itself and bringing together other people who study in other contexts where meetings are a main aspect of like the everyday life um, of governance, of resistance, of making things happen, and started thinking about how meetings are really our method of collective agency. They are how we come together to make things happen. If you want to do a project, the first thing you say is, "Let's have a meeting. Who should be there?" Right? Um, there are our primary method of agency, of doing agency together, doing things together, making things happen. And so started to think about that, and started to think about it with other people. Felt like I needed a lot more people to work with, and I have a collaborator at Stockholm University, Renita Tedball, who studied meetings and bureaucracy, um, and has also studied meetings in schools and other contexts, um, and how people organize meetings in other contexts. And com- so thinking about have been thinking with her a lot about how do we reconceptualize this thing that we take for granted called a meeting, and really think about what it is.
Mm.
It Yeah, and I've been talking to a lot of people about that and writing about it for some time, and also simultaneously trying to think more and more intentionally about my own meetings and the meetings that I go to, and kind of reading activist landscapes through their meetings, which was a pretty big insight to me, that when I walk into a meeting of a new group or organization,
Mm.
I can tell a lot
Yeah,
about what's going on just by the meeting landscape, just by how the meeting is organized and how it's facilitated, who's talking to who, what happens before and after the meeting, um, the dynamics of the meeting itself. And yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about that.
yeah, yeah. It makes so much sense that that is a good reflection of what is going on in that space. When you like see that, oh yeah, this is actually all we do is meet and and try to figure out stuff together. um, and also
Yeah.
like the structure of a meeting is like the container in which the things happen, right? So that has to influence like the internal stuff and the like the interpersonal stuff that happens within that container, the way that it is set up. I'm wondering what are some of the things you found that groups have in common that are doing well, or groups have in common that are not doing so well?
Um, yeah, I think before I
Yeah.
answer that question, I'd like to just talk just say briefly like the sort of not too rigid
Mm-hmm.
because I'm sort of allergic to rigid
Yep.
models, but the sort of ontology of like of how I think about the different ways that I think about what a meeting
Oh yeah,
is,
please.
and then I can talk a little bit about what that
Yeah.
means for groups' effectiveness and their meeting practices. My co-author and I have been thinking about really tried to boil down um, the ways that people are talking about what meetings
Mm-hmm.
are in their context into a couple of concepts and because meetings aren't just one thing. We were like, are they rituals? No, they're not exactly like rituals. Are they containers? Yeah, but they're more than just
Mm-hmm.
that, right? So we have this sort of right now. It's like three things that we think meetings are, and the first one is that they are architectures. They're the way that we um, they are they're the and to me that's really important because they're the architecture of our movements. Um, our movements are made up of meetings, a series of meetings of who meets with who, when, how, right? And they're also like each individual meeting is designed, whether
Mm.
intentionally or by default. It's designed. There's an architect. Um, and then second, meetings are practices of circulation. So there's a structural aspect of meetings in that they structure what we do, and they are structured to structure what we do, and um, and they're also practices of circulation, right? Like meetings are the medium within which things circulate, and both things like objects, like agendas, um, stuff,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
coffee, food, um, uh, all kinds of things, but also their practices of circulating new words, new discourses, new concepts, or old concepts, right? Ways of thinking, ways of doing. They circulate
Mm.
things. If you want to put something out there, you put it out there in a couple of meetings, and you start talking about it in a certain way, and all of a sudden everybody is talking about it a certain way. Books. People say, "Oh, what are you reading? This is what I'm reading. This is what they said that I think is important," and all of a sudden that circulates through meetings, right? People start dropping it
Mm.
in. So they're practices of circulation, and um, they're also makers. So I talked about how their meetings are architectures, but they're also architects. They make things happen, right? So like meetings have a certain and ascribing to them a certain kind of agency. It can be really helpful, and you can hear this when people talk when they're like, oh, when people refer to a meeting, they're like, oh, this happened. These people are in this have this tension, which is really affecting what is happening out there, at the
Mm.
action, or what can and can't happen at the action. And that tension played out at this meeting, and it started at this other meeting when there was this argument over who was facilitating. Like, right, people trace things back, and what they're talking about is the agency of the meeting, the power of the meeting to make things happen. So when we start thinking about that, to get to your
Mm-hmm.
question, um, then we can start talking about like we can ask different questions about our
Yeah.
access meetings, right? We can ask, what is this meeting making, right? What do we want it to make? What do our meetings usually make? Like, how are our meetings working? What are they doing? um, because if you ask people, why do you meet?
Mm.
Well, I'll ask you, like, why do you meet in your work?
Um, yeah. To get stuff done, usually, like to work together, have like a working session with people. And those are the most satisfying
Mm-hmm.
meetings. The least satisfying meetings are just to update each other. I feel like there's
Uh-huh.
so many better ways to update each other than to be in a room together and get distracted by like interpersonal stuff. And if it's just for the transfer of information, I feel like those are the, the most draining meetings. And then to make decisions, to like discuss, to like formulate new points of view together, because everybody comes together with their own point of view, and then you need to like synthesize, learn what all the other people think, and then synthesize together, like make new points of view or new perspectives that are shared among everyone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, like you said, a whole bunch of things that your meetings make, and one of the things is that you didn't say that the meeting actually makes, but it does, is the emotions that come out of it, right? So when you say those are the most draining meetings, that means that meetings make a feeling of being drained, right? Meetings make lower energy sometimes. Meetings make frustration, right? Sometimes, and sometimes they make decisions, but more importantly, I mean, you talked about, and my guess is that your meetings are pretty productive then, that meetings make a sort of thinking together, where they can make that. The most productive meetings make a new way of thinking, so that everybody is not just updating each other. It's not just like meetings don't just make sort of same pageness, right? Like, so that we're all on the same page, we have to share information. But they also can make a new, like newly synthesized ways of thinking, right? And thinking that couldn't have happened, that isn't just me sharing with you and you sharing with me, but is us doing something together that we couldn't have done by ourselves. And that's a good reason to meet, I think. That's a really good reason to meet. But if there's no intention that, like, I want this meeting to make a new way of thinking together, then you're not, as a meeting facilitator or architect, you're not going to plan it that way, right? If you think like, oh, we're just going to get together and update each other on our committees and what they're doing or whatever, then you're going to take for granted the meeting structure, which is like, we come in and we say, okay, we're going to report out who wants to go first. And those meetings are generally disastrous, I think. Even if they don't feel like a disaster, like over time, because they bring energy down and they make people not want to come. The challenge for activist meetings, which is different than in like corporate meetings, is that no one's paid to be there. So if all you're doing is meeting and people are having a shitty time in those meetings, and those meetings, people are leaving those meetings feeling less connected, less recognized, bad, like, or if those meetings are always a power struggle, they're not going to come back. They're eventually not going to come back. Maybe they won't come back really soon. So I think that the most important meeting practices are actually a lot of what we did at the Micro Solidarities event, which are really connecting to yourself and to each other. And I mean, I think in every activist or organizing meeting, every single person in that meeting, every single meeting should have a meaningful one-on-one interaction where they feel personally recognized. Preferably a one-on-one interaction. It could be a collective interaction, especially if it's a small meeting. But everyone should get a chance to say what's going on with them in their life. To be a whole person, not just to be like a bot that's helping this movement in this way. Nobody's doing it for that, People need to be recognized as humans. So you have to have practices to do that and regularize those practices. And not skip them in the interest of time, right? Like, we don't have time for a check-in. You always have time for a check-in. You don't have time not to have a check-in. Because if you don't have a check-in, then all that stuff that people would have checked in with is going to implicitly come into your meeting and waste a whole bunch of time and derail, the purpose of the meeting and make everybody feel bad. You don't have time not to have a check-in.
That's one of the main things I also took away from that session you led in Belgium. Was like the most important thing about activist meetings is like that everybody feels good about them, and then you can start doing stuff in the time that remains after everybody is like acknowledged and appreciated and feels seen. As like the number one priority should be the number one priority. And I wonder, what are some of the practices that, because like we talked about that as well there, and we've like found a lot of interesting stuff just with the people that were there in that workshop. But I'm wondering, what did you find works in terms of prioritizing that and making meetings like a good experience for people, versus like something they do because they think it's important but they hate doing actually.
I think that there's a lot of practices that I think are really essential, and
Yeah.
that the people I work with have found to be really essential. Um, I think the simplest ones are really like just attending to whatever your structure is. There's no sort of magical
Mm.
practices. There are practices that are really easily regularizable that don't take a whole lot of skill, um, to hold, like a
Yeah.
check-in, right? A meaningful check-in, which can be done in a couple of different ways. If you have a group of 40, you're not going to probably do a go around because that will take your entire meeting. Um, to make it a meaningful check-in, right? If everybody needs to talk for about a minute in order to feel like they're here, like they've landed as a human, then you may need to divide up into small groups and do that. But make sure that everybody gets to say, "Ugh, I'm so tired today." Great. That's not that. That's great that you got to say that.
Yeah.
Now we can get to the work, right? Otherwise, you're going to be bringing that in, like, "Oh, I'm just so tired," or "This bad thing has happened," or "I'm, really distracted." If you get to say that to another person and say, "Oh my gosh, like I, had to bring my parent to the hospital, and I'm just really worried about them." Like if you get to say that, then you can get it off your plate. Somebody, you've shared it, and you can move towards something else.
Mm.
um, and you feel like somebody was like, "God, that must be really hard." That's all they have to say, really. It's not. So I mean, the more that people also, like, our meetings are also training us to interact in a certain way, right? Uh, we're like we develop habits of interaction, and if your habit is always trying to get recognized, um, because there's no structure for doing that. But if your habit is like, "Oh, I know I'm going to come to this meeting, someone's going to like see me as a
Mm.
person, and I'm then going to learn about other people, and I'm just going to feel different when I leave than when
Yeah.
I come." Like then you're expecting that, and you're expecting to interact in a certain way. And you can also like get people used to
Yeah.
listening, um, so that everybody not only shares, but they also like hear where everybody else is, so that they realize that like the whole meeting isn't about them. Some people go through their life very sort of self-centered, and good meeting practices, are not only about being recognized, but about
Yeah.
recognizing, about listening, to other people. And that can also ward off a lot of the bad practices that people have when they're not recognized, which is talking too much, not listening well, trying to take all the
Mm.
space, not being aware of how much space. Um, you can just regularize practices that make that harder to do,
Yeah.
right? So you don't even have to. The hard thing is people often ask, like, "Well, how do you interrupt people when they're talking too much?" Well, if you're meeting regularly with the same people, um, people should people will learn how to meet in a
Yeah.
different way. We all learn how to meet anyway,
Mm.
like we learn turn taking, we learn raising our hands in school if that's a ritual that your school does. People can learn how to meet in different ways.
Mm. Yeah. What really stuck out to me in what you just said is like when people are not being recognized, they they don't stop talking. Like they're fighting for attention, and if you just give it to them naturally, that sense of like, okay, cool that you're here. You don't need to fight for it.
Right.
We'll we see what sweet a human being you are. You don't no need to like prove to us how eloquent or yeah, how eloquent or smart you
Right.
are. Just contribute what's valuable, and it's all fine. Yeah, wow. Sometimes these things that feel like I've learned them 100 times already, like someone says them in a slightly different way, and it's like, oh wow, that's a really cool insight. uh,
Totally. Yeah,
Sweet.
I feel that way too. Yeah, I love watching people facilitate, towards similar ends,
Mm,
in very different ways. Like I learned a lot at the Micro Solidarities conference. There were a lot of the same sort of ideas and, um, intentions, um, in vision for how people might interact in a way that is more humane and, humanizing, and, um, as a lot of the other as in a lot of the other environments that I'm in. But the practices are very different, and I think that that's really cool. That like there's no one right way to do meetings.
mm,
There's no perfect thing, and a lot of it does depend on who is in the room, um, and what are their default practices. What are the things
yeah.
what are the norms of their community. And I think recognizing that too, that our meetings have a culture, that we're reproducing things, we're creating a culture in our meetings, a space and a time and a way of being together that might feel easy for some people and hard for others, that might feel more natural, which just means that it's more customary um, for folks coming from certain backgrounds than from others, and that affects power,
Yep.
right? And I think that that's the main thing that people often don't talk about in meetings, is that we have not just power dynamics in terms of who's in control, but also like what are the practices and how do they feel for different people. So like going fast, being the loudest voice in the room, uh, really analytical, abstract talk feels really good and empowering to certain people and really alienating
Yeah.
to others. And um, particularly for activist communities that are trying to get people who are directly affected by the things that we're fighting for in the room and make sure that they have power in that room, make sure that they can take leadership and thought leadership, that their experiences are listened
Mm.
to. We have to create practices that are not alienating. Um, and that means that can be very disruptive, because it means that we might be creating practices that feel really uncomfortable to people who usually feel very empowered
Mm.
in meeting spaces and feel like it's natural for them to feel comfortable
Yeah.
speaking, answering any question, um, expecting to be listened to. So if you are essentially like, you have to squish those people down a little bit, because it's important. It's super important. And I've been that person,
Yeah,
in my life
I was
for
gonna
sure.
say, I feel like I'm that person in a lot of the groups I'm a part of. It's like where I'm like really comfortable with the way those meetings are going, and most of the other people as
Yeah.
well. But sometimes like dissatisfaction surfaces, and then like yeah, that's something I'm learning currently, is like how to integrate my own discomfort with like someone else voicing their need that is not like I would be fine with the way we're doing this, or the other way around, like not to be too adamant with my own needs for how meetings should look like, especially when
Mm.
like one of the groups that I'm a part of, that I'm going to go to a meeting with those people after this conversation. So actually perfect timing. Um, I am like, I used to be the person who led most meetings or facilitated most meetings, and I was really uncomfortable with that because I didn't want to be like that person. But also,
Mm.
if I didn't do it, it didn't happen as much.
Mm.
And now like it's opening up and other people are doing it, and like my challenge is to like be okay with the way it's going, and not be like, oh, you should do that differently, and be supportive in sharing that space, while like learning that my way of doing it is not the only way. And I feel like that's
Mm.
yeah, it's like that we together in that group are going through this like growing up process right now, where it's like distributing power and um, responsibility in a way that feels a bit painful sometimes, because it's like this growing up process, but it feels really important and valuable. So yeah, I,
Can I
yeah,
ask a question about
yeah, yeah,
those
yeah,
meetings
please.
and what that feels like? I wonder what it when you stopped facilitating
Mm.
those meetings, or even when you facilitated them, did you did you plan them with other people, or did you plan them by yourself?
So in part by myself, in part it was a co-creative thing of like there's an open agenda and everybody can just put stuff on it.
Ah.
But usually
Mhm.
I was the person. Usually still am the person. Not this week, but the past months, I always was the person who like prepared the first couple of points on the agenda and sent it out and reminded everyone to put their stuff in. So yeah.
Mm. Yeah. It can be really helpful to have two people who are
Mm.
co-responsible during the meeting as well. And I've learned a huge amount from just from co-facilitating
Mm.
with people who have really different styles than me.
Yeah.
And by co-facilitating, I mean having a planning meeting before the meeting where we talk about what do we want this meeting to make? What are our objectives for this meeting? What does this meeting need to do for our group? And I find that objectives come before, for me, objectives always come before agenda,
Yeah.
right? Because what we need to do has to do with what we want the meeting to do. Otherwise, we're just doing activities,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And then you can say like, oh, we need this meeting to make, we're really fragmented right now, right? Then you have to have that conversation with somebody else to say, well, how's the group feeling to you? What do we have coming up? We have to feel really unified for this thing coming up, and we don't right now. So primarily this meeting has to make that. And so, yeah, we also have to like get updated on the spreadsheet and the budget and the whatever. Okay. But like, we have to leave this meeting feeling collective because we can't do that in an email.
Yeah.
And if we have that conversation before, then we can plan a meeting together, and it's helpful to make sure that, like I'm not the only one who's feeling, I'm not any more in tune with an organization than with a project than anybody else. And it's helpful to have at least two people weigh in on where we think we are. And then what do we want this meeting to make? And then what do we do, right? What is our agenda? And how do we do it? And how do we divide that up in a way that we're performing the kind of collaboration or collectivity that we're asking, that we're trying to bring about in the whole group. And an equally, maybe even the most important practice for meetings is debriefing, and is, I think, the most overlooked in activist groups that are like, okay, we did it, we got through the meeting, let's go on to the next thing. The next thing is, how did it go? And really, what did it make? And again, just like a check-in, you don't have time not to debrief. You don't have time to have the same shitty meeting over and over and over, and it's never going to change. Or the same mediocre meeting, even, where it's like, okay, we did, it was okay. They have to be great. They have to be like life-giving.
Yeah, I feel like enrolling people into the value of debriefing and preparing is like the crux here, because like when you're having mediocre meetings or like even bad meetings, then like having more meetings to prepare and debrief doesn't sound like the solution. It's like, oh no, I like, why would I want that? But the question or the way you've just phrased it is like, yeah, we don't have time to have more shitty meetings. And like asking the question, what would it be like if our meetings got better over time? I feel like would be a really good way. And what would we need to do in order to make that happen?
Yeah. I think part of that is thinking about the meeting as often the main event, right? It's not, you're not meeting in order to do the work. The meeting is the work. If especially in activist groups where we're building power together, and we're building spaces together where we feel recognized in a world that doesn't recognize us, right? In a capitalist system that treats us all as individual productivity bots, or as burdens, or as unnecessary, right? Or as exploitable. Meetings are literally what we're doing in order to create spaces where we don't feel that way, where we feel different, where we can relate to each other as beings that are becoming something together, that are building worlds together. They have to be like joyful, and not always joyful like happy, but like they have to be home. They have to be a place where we feel like, and if you think about the meeting as the main event, then it's like, I mean, I don't usually use sports analogies, but but like, if the meeting is the game, then of course you're going to practice for it, and you're going to talk about how it went afterwards. But if you see the meeting as the practice, or as the like drills or something, then it's not a big deal. But meeting is what we do.
Yeah.
I mean, how often are we on the front lines? And like, we better really know how to have each other's back when we're
Mm.
on the front lines, like when we're actually at an action, when we're actually confronting power. We better have had really good meetings to trust each other enough in that
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. And what I find so exciting about what you just said is like that's like, yeah, it's the main event, and we get to choose how we do it. Like we get to co-create it together. That's like such an exciting thought. Is
Totally.
like meetings are a space where we have all the power. Like all the power is in that room, and it's just a matter of like
Right.
how do we share it? How do we set up a structure so everybody can participate in it? And then it can become this really
Yeah.
exciting thing where like for these 2 hours we're here together, and we don't have to like we're not a worker, we're not an employee, we're not an entrepreneur, we're not nothing, we're just like the person in the room with everyone else, and we get to decide how we do that. So that's like yeah, that's that's exciting. I'm looking forward to meetings now. From that
Yeah.
perspective, it's like, oh shit. um yeah. You said something before about like in bringing people together in meetings, or like when different people with different needs and different styles of facilitation come together, it gets like it gets tricky. And when we chatted a bit before we hit record, you mentioned like something you've been thinking about a lot recently is how to bring different people together, and um, what does it look like for them to have meaningful conversations. And I wonder if you could, if you just want to like rant about that a little bit, like what what are your thoughts? um why do you think it's important to bring different people together and for them to have meaningful conversations? Might be a very obvious question, but
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not really. I mean, we all also. I mean, within the U.S., there are so many different organizing and activist
mm,
cultures, right? There's so many different places that people are trying to do social change work, and that looks really, really different at like a liberal, older people, white church,
mhm,
where they're trying to get Democrats elected to the Senate,
yeah,
right? Like they're doing social change work and they're having a particular kind of meeting, and that's fine. Or maybe they're lobbying for a particular bill, which is the electoral politics in the U.S. are um, and legislative politics are um, really important, right? Like they're actually really important. I mean, we have like we have a mass incarceration system and a police system that yes needs to be abolished and first needs to be like radically reformed,
mm,
um, and maybe all those things at the same time. But like I have colleagues who are fighting against mass incarceration against solitary confinement within mass incarceration, and so they're lobbying for bills, right, to reduce to reduce solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is state
yeah,
torture, really directly, and 1 in 5 people in Massachusetts who are incarcerated spend some time in solitary confinement. That's a
mm,
whole lot of people who are being tortured on a daily basis, and so addressing the details of that is not it's not bullshit. It's
yeah,
real.
yeah,
It has a real effect, and it's really important. So that's something that can be done at any level, right? And that lots of people think is important, and so lots of people are meeting to figure out how to do that, right? Um, but how do you get people to meet together? How do you get those like liberal white church people who, as soon as they learn about the extent and the reality of solitary confinement, um, are appalled and want to do
mm,
something. Many of them want to do something. How do you get them in a room with people who have experienced solitary confinement? That's something that my colleague Cassandra Ben-Sahi, who works with the Massachusetts Against Solitary Confinement, um, directs that organization, and is really trying to get people to listen to to people who are directly affected. How do you listen to survivors of solitary,
mhm,
um, tell their stories and use that as a mobilizing tool, so that it isn't just about being in solidarity with those people, and it's not really about being in relationship as in like necessarily direct relationship. necessarily like being friends with folks. It's not that kind of
Yeah.
relationship necessarily. It could be, but it's an accountability relationship. It's like I'm accountable to these folks who have survived state torture and who have dedicated, like a good portion of the rest of their lives once they get out to doing something about it. And I'm accountable to them, to making my phone calls, right? To calling to actually like calling when they ask, writing letters, writing emails, the sort of little things that we consider like, maybe sort of more bourgeois activism, right? From the comfort of our desks. So how do you get those people what do those meetings look like when you bring people together like that? And so I like follow people like Cassandra, who makes those encounters happen, and who prepares everybody for those encounters. How do you prepare everybody in that situation to meet together who would not normally ever encounter each other in life? And how do you create a meeting in which that engagement can be good, not tokenizing, not messed up, not exploitative, not romanticizing, not white saviorism, like lots of knots, right? Like there's many, many, many ways for that to go wrong. And as an activist in the US need to figure out how to do it anyway, because we need all of us. Like we need all of us. Like like we're on on a million precipices, precipi. I don't know what the plural of precipice is. But we're on a lot of them, right? We're on cliffs, and we need all of us in order to pull us back, in order to create and pull us back into something better, right? To create worlds that we can live in, worlds that, like, what does it look like to have a world that can hold all of us, when all of us is a whole lot of whole huge range of people. Yeah, and I think that meetings have to do that. Like we have to be able to at least be in a room together. Like how can we say we're building worlds when we can't even build an hour or we can encounter each other? Like these are our little worlds. Like we and if you can't imagine inviting, like somebody who speaks a different language, who is a recent refugee, who was recently incarcerated, to your meeting that is about creating justice, if you can't imagine them in that space, owning that space, then what the fuck are we doing? Right. Like, what are we doing? And I think in the US we've had to it's obvious when that can't happen, and it's obvious when how frustrating it is when people aren't able to, when people say, oh, people should be leading these, environmental justice work and actions should be led by Indigenous people. Okay, and what do those meetings look like that are led by Indigenous people and folks are showing up into them in a good way, right? Like settlers are showing up in a good way. What does that look like? What does it feel like? Can we play with that form? I think there's like endless work to be done there,
Yeah, I think it relates or like connects perfectly to what we were talking about before, as meetings being the main thing. Meetings is where, like, that's what it is. And it's like, if we're talking about a good life for all or like a livable future for all, and we can't have a meeting for like at least two different like people from two different bubbles, then a livable future for all sounds very hard to achieve. So yeah, appreciate the like. This would be a good starting point for any group that is working on a vision like that. It's like, okay, where are we homogenous or inaccessible to people that we are somehow in relationship with? One example came to mind for me here in Vienna. There's this activist movement going on. It's been going on for the hot phase has been going on for the past year roundabout, to block a highway construction project, and the people that are blocking it are mainly like young environmental activists and students, and the people that would be most affected by it are like a completely different group. that are living like on the outskirt of the city. It's like a very working class kind of neighborhood where this is being built through. And there are a lot of people that are like on the side of the activists and like also not happy about the construction going on. But there's also a lot of people that have very valid needs, like getting to work in time and not being stuck in traffic, and wanting to have better access to the city. And they see like, oh yeah, this highway could do that for us. So like, how do we get these two groups into a room and like figure out that maybe there's shared interest somewhere? And yeah, that's it's like if
How
we
how have you been?
I'm not like at the center of that movement. I'm not quite
Mm.
sure what has been going on, but my impression is like it was either you're on our side or we're gonna maybe try to talk to you, but if you're not really interested, we'll not bother and like think about how we can block the next thing happening. And there's been some like small organizing teams on like the like around actions. When there was an action, there were like always a couple of people talking to neighbors and talking to people from the area, um,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to manufacture some like common understanding. But it like what the impressions I got were it was very hard and it wasn't very successful. It might be that that's completely off. I'm also not sure like how like what the percentages are of people in that neighborhood actually being opposed to the construction and those in favor of it. But yeah, I feel like the there is some sense of like, oh, these activists are kind of aliens in our world, and they're coming and
Mm.
trying to tell us what to do, and that's like not helpful, right? It would be that movement would be so much more powerful if everybody was like, if there was a way to like capture all the different needs and some process for integrating them with each other and then formulating a common position from them. But I also think that
Mm.
can't be done like on the spot. That needs time and like social fabric that pre-exists. Um,
Mm.
and I wonder what you see about that. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Yeah. No, I wonder what you see about like the importance of undirected um, organizing, where it's not about like there's an issue and we're trying to organize around it or against something or for something, but just like
Mm.
building community for the sake of having like a network, so that when the next thing comes up, uh, we don't start at zero and we can build on that.
Yeah. I mean, that brings up all kinds of things. I mean, I think that there is a tradition and a sort of discipline of field of community organizing in the United States that is pretty well developed. So developed that it's very fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
um, but that is about really starting where people are, right? Like that is about and that is about instead of first identifying an issue and then figuring out how to fight it and then figuring out how to get everybody on board. It goes in the other direction of starting with the
Yep.
people and saying, okay, what's going on for you? What is live in your world right now? What it not what do you think, but what are you experiencing? And what does your suffering look like? What does your anger look like? What does your trauma look like? And what does your joy look like? What is your life about, right? What is going on in this community? And um, and working with people to develop a shared analysis first, of what's going
Mm.
on in their community, and then identifying an issue. So like in community organizing, you cut an issue out of out of the sort of out of a synthesis, out of a collective synthesis of what is reality, like, right, what are a lot of people's experiences of a thing, right? And then you figure out what it is you should fight for, um,
Mm.
and and that gets it out of the sort of theoretical activist driven
Yeah.
agenda setting and then trying to get people on board, which is not unlike trying to sell people a product,
Mm.
right? That you think you know better is good for them, and trying to convince them that they want it,
Yep.
that it will be good for them. Um, yeah, it's not any more respectful than that. Then I don't think, and also if you're thinking about like what is the world that comes after that, like what are you modeling? Um, Going into people's communities and telling them what's good for them is a not a if you scale that up,
Yep.
it's not a good model. It's a pretty
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
fascism,
We
right?
had
Like
that.
that's like somebody
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
done that, right? um, uh, and and there I think I mean I don't think that I don't think that we can get to uh, a better process through a really bad
Mm.
process, or and there's no end to this. Like there's no like, okay, we're going to build the better world and then you'll
Yep.
see how much you
Yep.
like it. That just is not how it's good. That makes no
Mm.
sense. And there's no historical precedent for that. Um,
And yet,
you have to start with where are
yeah.
people,
And yet that's how so many groups are approaching change. Like that's how I've been approaching change in the past, and how like the default way of acting on an impetus to change something looks, right. It's like
Yeah.
we're gonna like we have this goal, and we're gonna work to the end of that goal, and then things are gonna be different. This very um,
Yeah.
like cut into sections, and like yeah, and how to shift out of that into like a more organic and process based and like open emergent way of viewing change. It's like super interesting. Oh.
I mean, I think that is all about relationality, though.
Mm.
Like that is all about like who are you talking
Mm.
to and who are you listening to, right?
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and I think when activist communities, when young activists, young relatively privileged activists are really just sitting around talking to each other, it doesn't. I guess that's where my skepticism of building community for its own sake um, comes in. Is
Mm-hmm.
that those folks building community with each other, like that's great. They're just building a scene
Mm.
where they can feel more comfortable, and like it's important for young people to feel comfortable. It's not nothing, but it's not world
Yep.
changing, right? It isn't building something. You can't build something for somebody else. You have to build something with them,
Mm.
and so who are your people is really important. And if your people are people who are getting screwed by the system, then you better be in relationship with those people, because they're not your people otherwise. If they wouldn't claim you, you're not accountable to them. And as a matter of fact, you're doing things that they don't want you to
Right.
do. You there's no that isn't the thing. It's just not the
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
um, and so pretending that building community among yourselves is um, like it is somehow radicalizing of that project. I mean, to me, the challenge with all of these skills around building community is about building community across
Mm-hmm.
difference.
Yep.
Um, like, can we actually talk across difference? And that might be coming from a more privileged place,
Mm.
right? I'm not telling anyone else that they need to talk to me. But I'm saying that in order for me to do work, I need to
Yes.
get out of
Yep.
my own circles,
Mm.
um, and if people don't find it useful to include me in their meeting, that's fine. Like, I wish them luck, and I like would love to hear. But we're not in relationship, right? I mean, and once we're in relationship, then people can make demands of me also, and I want to be putting myself in a position where people can say, I need you to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it wouldn't be my first thing on my the first thing on my agenda, right? Because it doesn't affect me, it's not immediate in my world, I'm working on something else. But if I'm in a relationship with somebody, like real relationship, because we've really built community across difference, then they can make demands on me, on my time, on my energy, on my money if I have it, right? Like on and to me, like that's privilege isn't something to be gotten rid of. It's something to like distribute,
Yeah.
right? Like, and once I'm part of collectives where people can call me and say, I need you to do
Hmm.
this,
Yeah.
I'm not doing that out of guilt. I'm doing it out of
Yeah.
relationship, out of
That's when
accountability.
you can,
That's what community is
yeah, and
for.
that's when you can really put your privilege to work as well. And you can stop sitting around and be like, oh shit, why am I so privileged and everyone else isn't? But you can actually make use of
Yeah,
it. But yeah, without relationship, it doesn't work.
it
Yeah.
doesn't work. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And so, I mean, all those community practices are really important for building relationships. And we're always practicing. There's nothing other than
Yep.
practice. It's not like, oh, now we've gotten there.
Hmm.
We have to keep practicing, which is why we have to keep having good
Yeah.
meetings. They're just
Yeah.
opportunities to keep
Yeah.
practicing.
And what if like practice and the actual thing were the same? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Um. hmm. So I had this before we hit record. We chatted a little bit, and I had this thing of, or it's like floating around in my mind, and it like came up again just now when we talked a little bit about organizing. Um, where when we talked in Belgium, you were really like getting the point across that the United States is at like a point in history where it's either gonna like, go one way or another way, and like there's a lot of pressure on on a lot of communities, and that's why there's like so much activism that's necessary. And we had actually very different perspectives on it. From my perspective in the United, like I always thought, oh wow, there's so much going on in the States. It's such a great place to be active as an activist. And when I talked to you, you're like, oh no, actually, it's not because it's so nice and like people are so good at it, but they need to be because otherwise they're just not gonna survive. Because it's literally at this point
Mm.
about yeah, about being fed and being like safe and supporting each other in very basic ways. Um, and I'm wondering what you see about the like. To me, there's this element of like humans are so good at innovation when they really have to, um, and
Mm.
I'm wondering what you see about. I'm not sure like what the question is in there. Um, maybe it's like how are they doing? How are you doing? Maybe just that.
That's a good
Yeah.
question. I love when it's like how. Yeah, I love it when a question boils down to like how
Yeah,
are you
yeah.
actually?
Actually, how are you doing?
how's it how's it
Yeah.
going? Um, yeah, I there's a lot to pick up on in there, and I guess one of the things that I want to say is that that it isn't that this is this unique point in
Mm,
history. It might be. You never know. Um, you never know what the unique point in history is when you're in it, but sometimes you do. But it isn't that. It's that I mean, it's that the United States has always been like is a country that is has always been about
mm,
crisis, right, and um, about encounters of difference and power and violence and surviving,
mm.
right? And um, it's always been about struggle, and that struggle manifests differently for different people. But I mean, the United States was founded on by through genocide and
Yeah,
settlers and missionaries and um, conquerors and was built through slavery and the trafficking of human beings um, and has always and continues to be about displacement for the purpose of capital, right? For the purpose of capital expansion, and that is the story of the United
mm,
States. And there are many stories within that story, right? That's the overall structural story is settler colonialism and white supremacy and the encounter of those through capital
yeah,
and through capital expansion. And also, like, within that there are so many stories of I guess I wouldn't call it innovation. I would call it like there are survival strategies that have, I mean, everyone who has survived that has done so through using either power to get on top of it, or like deep like ancestral knowledge and community and collaboration to survive it, right? Um, and that's why we're all here. Like we're all here as out of some kind of survival strategy, whether violent um, or collaborative or some kind of combination. And it's more often some kind of combination, depending on who our ancestors are and how our stories have unfolded. Um, and I mean, I am. So how am I? Like I am. I feel really. I guess I want to make it clear. I feel really grateful to be um, in the landscape of the U.S. Studying and working and um, collaborating with young people and activists and change makers. When people ask me like, who are my people? Like that's my answer is people who are like really studying the world in order to figure out how to bring um, bring us together in a better way, right? And what that looks like across different and the U.S. is an amazing place to do that. It is an amazing place to do that. In part, yeah, because there's so much horrible shit going on and always has been here, or has been for the past 400 years, or definitely for in the history of this country and its development. But it's also, yeah, I think you have to go out of your way to avoid, to figure out how to create a community that doesn't encounter difference here. And I don't think that that's necessarily true in Europe. I think you can have your little scene of people who have pretty similar backgrounds, and then the major issue and what people talk about in European progressive communities, people talk about gender dynamics so much, and it's not that gender dynamics are not a thing here; they're a huge thing here. But gender is a huge structuring thing in our lives, and in our movements and in our work and our communities, and is never not present. But it seems like it's in my observation from the outside in some European scenes, it's the main like power dynamic that people encounter in their everyday life, and so it's the main thing that people are talking about. Um, and here, that's just not true. If that's true, then you're making it true because you're avoiding all racial difference um, and age and class and sexual identity and gender identity, like all the other things. If you're really just talking about sort of second wave women and men and power. Not again, not that that's not important, but that there's so many other there's so many intersecting um, lines of difference here that I think make for sort of endless richness and potential and vision. And I mean, I've learned how to learn about power through learning how to listen, how to shut up, and it doesn't seem like it in this podcast because I'm just talking all the time.
Well, that's what you're here for too, and so
Yeah,
very grateful that you're doing that.
yeah, well, but I wonder. I mean, I'm probably caricaturing the European activist scenes too, and I wonder how difference shows up in your community and in the work that you're doing, and what does that look like? What does it look like to think through who's most affected, and what does difference mean, and diversity mean in your context?
Yeah. So it is true, like gender is in a lot of groups is like the main point of conflict when it comes to like power and diversity, or like the main point of like where friction is happening. And people get uncomfortable and people need to like reevaluate their structure of knowing that they have about themselves and the world and like their story. And then there is, I feel like one that is where people are that's fairly easy for people is age and like class background, where like within like so activist movements are most, not all activist movements, but a lot of them, it's very generalizing, but they are pretty white, in Europe, and or at least in the part where I'm seeing, um,
Mm-hmm.
and within that, the diversity that is happening is like more about age and like education, um, and yeah, and those are not conflict points usually. They only become conflict points on the intersection with gender. Like the
Mm-hmm.
classical old white men, not knowing how to give space, or share space, is like a recurring theme that is like very present in these spaces. And yeah, I feel like the people who are most affected thing, that's like we still have a lot of work to do there, including being inclusive to people who are most affected, and even identifying who that is. Like, what does it mean to be affected by an issue that we're talking about in our little activist group, and how do we reach those people, and what skills do we need in order to, um, reach out to them, and be inclusive in a way that is not patronizing, and that is not, like, yeah, white savior, or like male savior even, in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, I feel like there's like a real, we can learn a lot from what's happening in the US. And maybe this is the, like that feeling that I had before, and you just put words to it, is like
Mm-hmm.
there's, a lot more richness in those spaces, because there's just more naturally given, or not naturally, but like through the history, there's more diversity, and like things are more mixed up and more in close contact with each other, that are, that have been kept separately in Europe, and like all like bottled up
Mm-hmm.
in their little segments. So I feel like that's the main challenge here, is to get back in touch and like break out of your own box, and do so in a way that is not like stepping on anyone's toes, but yeah, go explore, and try to learn how other people are seeing the issues that we are seeing, and get in touch with people that are affected in a way that invites them into their own power, and that,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, like invites people into seeing that, even seeing that there is an issue, and that they could do
Yeah.
something about it. Yeah. Mm, I don't know. Yeah, that's why I'm so interested in organizing, because it's like such a new thing to me. It's not a thing that
Mm-hmm.
is, it doesn't have a history here, and the idea of like, like talking to people about what they care about, and like finding similarities and like overlap, and connecting them with resources, and, empowering them to like do their own thing, just because I know like another person that's doing a similar thing, and like connecting these, it's like, that's a really cool idea. um, uh,
Yeah. I think on the theme of meetings, one of the things that has always been really helpful for me is in community organizing. There's a concept of the one-on-one
mm,
meeting, the one-on-one, um, and it's a little bit different than the way that people are now using the term one-on-one meeting, um, in in European contexts and in non-organizing contexts. But that the purpose of the one-on-one is not um, is not to sell people on an issue. It's to really understand what their self-interest
yeah.
is, and to share your own self-interest, and your own, um, why you do what you do. And so like not implicitly putting yourself in this sort of hierarchy of like, I'm meeting with you in order to try to use my
Mm,
privilege to connect you with someone with power. No.
mm.
Like I'm meeting with you because I am not in relationship
Yeah.
with you, And if we're not in a relationship, we can't do anything
Yeah.
together. We can't be part of anything together. And I want to do things because why? And like figuring out why, and like how do you represent that to other people? How do you represent that to people who are like you in particular ways, and how do you represent that to people who are not like you? And figuring out how to represent yourself, how to present yourself, how to present your self-interest. Like, who are you? Like, why do you care? Why do you give a shit? Because if I don't know why you give a shit, if I don't know why you're in it, then we can't work together. Because and particularly across difference, like, then it's very easy for me to make up a story, which may or may not be true, that you're in it for your own ego and ultimately for your own power, and you're just, this is just gobbledygook that you're talking about
Yeah.
empowering other people and whatever, right?
Yep.
Like, that's really about you being the guy who gets to do all the things, like, and just knowing that people are going to make up their stories. That's important. That's a survival
Yeah,
mechanism.
right.
That's how
Yeah.
people like understand the world. Like, they have to read power into the world, or else they're going to be, drowned in it. And so what does it look like to not, to interrupt that process and to build a real relationship with someone? You have to be able to say, like, why do I care? And like, just say it. And that takes a huge amount of work. And so a lot of like ongoing work. It's not even a one and done thing. I mean, most organizers tell their story over and over again, whether it's a banal story of like really understand, like, becoming woke or whatever because of something that happened or something that they saw, and understanding who they are in the world and where they fit in the structure of things, why their life turned out the way that it did, whether good or bad, or more complicated, which it usually is. But also, you can't ask anyone else to tell you their story and their self-interest if you can't if you don't even know your own. And so figuring out how to master that one-to-one meeting across difference is really, like, if you can't do that, then don't try to develop a meeting where other people can step into their power. Like, that's not even meaningful. Those are just words. You have to be able to like actually talk to people across difference. And that's something that struck me about you, is that you're really actually incredibly good at that. And like, especially for someone your age, who you say you haven't been studying activism and organizing for that long, but like, I mean, you're you seem really inclined to that. And so I don't know, I admired that a lot at the gathering, the way that you just sort of went into building one-on-one connections. And just to say that those are meetings too.
Right. Yeah.
Like, when you figure out how to like talk about who you are and what matters to you, that isn't something that is easy for everyone. And so also helping other people to do that, who are a little bit lost in it, who, like, if you ask them why did you come to this gathering, why are you here, in a deeper way, why are you part of this organization, what is this to you, that's a very intimate question for a lot of people, and they're not used to being asked questions like that. And so figuring out how to run a meeting like that, is great. I mean, is huge. People practice one-on-ones all the time, across difference. Like, can you walk around that neighborhood of the people who are where they're going to build a highway, and knock on people's doors and like have a meaningful interaction with them, tell them why you're here, listen to what's going on with them, what's this to them, what's everything else to them, what do they care about, not trying to sell them your movement, just trying to be human with humans.
Thanks for the acknowledgement, that when you were talking about like, you got to get good at that, I was like looking at how I'm doing with that, and I was like, I could get better at that. And then you're like, oh, you're really good at this, and I was like, huh, really? Thanks.
It doesn't mean you can't get better.
Right.
Everybody can get better. I mean,
sure.
I'm not that good at it, so I've been doing it for
that's a lie. I think you're really good at this as well. Jen did a little one-on-one demonstration on the last night of that gathering in Belgium that we're always talking about, and we're just sitting around drinking beer and talking about organizing, and you were like, okay, let's do a demo, and and Jen just grabbed the person sitting next to her and was like, okay, how much time do you have? 10 minutes? Okay. And it was just like within 10 minutes figured out like what the shared interest was, and like found some resources to connect that person with. And it was really impressive to me. I was like sitting there like, okay, I want to be able to do that. That's like so amazing, to have a conversation like that where you're not like, it didn't feel like you were um, trying to sell that person, anyone, and anything, and trying to like convince someone about something. It was actually just like honestly being interested in what's important to them, and then um, yeah, like that the next step always becomes clear when there's clarity about like what's important and what's the challenge at hand. Then it's always like obvious what to do next. But if you go to people like, we should do this next, and there hasn't been this connection of like, this is what my interest is, this is what your interest is, and like what would you need in order for your like well-being to be improved, or for your mission to advance, then you won't be able to like, tell anyone this is what you should do. um, I wonder if you have any recommendations for resources around like this kind of interaction, that would be valuable for people to look at.
Um, yeah, for one-on-one interactions, sure. I mean, there are a lot of there are a lot of there are a lot of books. I actually think that these the basic organizing trainings actually need to be trainings,
Mm,
need to be in person and
yeah.
practiced. Even though there's a lot written about community organizing, that I mean, I assign a lot of things in classes
Mm,
that I teach, but I don't think that any of it can stand on its own. I mean, I think that these are not solo
yep.
practices. This is not something we can get good at individually, because we're not fundamentally individuals in this work.
Yep.
We're nothing individually. Um, we can get good at being with ourselves, and that's a totally other discipline, um, uh, around. There are lots of spiritual practices around the integrity of the individual and trying to figure out, what we are, and um, but and that isn't my area, but I it's possible that like books can be good for that.
Mm,
um, but I think ultimately, like, I don't want to recommend just solo
yep.
resources. Everyone's got a Google machine and can figure it out for themselves if they want to. Um, but I think that doing work in um, collectively is really important, and I think having a group of people, which is why I think the micro solidarities stuff
Mm,
is really a helpful model, a way of thinking about, like, if you have a crew, a group of 3 or 4 or 5 people that you meet with regularly, that you can practice different forms of relationality with, that's really great.
yeah.
Um, Beyond that, I think. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of so I have a training collective. I would be remiss if I didn't
Mm-hmm.
mention the collective that I'm a part of, called the Stoke
Mm-hmm.
Collective, where the Stoke Collective .org. If you do .com, you'll get some religious organization in the southern part of the United States. So
Yeah,
.org.
we'll put that in the show notes so
And
people
we
can find it.
and yeah, we run facilitation training series, and a meeting well
Mm,
webinar, which is a version of what I did in at the gathering, but virtually. They're not always Europe friendly times, but we can work on that if there are people in Europe who are interested in joining. Um, but that can be, I think, a helpful way to find a community of practice.
yep.
Um, and find people to be circulating the same ideas and practices together, um, and so that you're not yourself as an individual trying to introduce a new thing to a collective, because it will never not feel like, I mean, it's hard for it not to feel like you're selling
Yep.
something. But if you've attended something with somebody and you're
Yep.
like, let's try this thing, let's do some experiments together, then that is in itself relational, and then that can change
Mm,
everything. So I highly recommend finding at least a co-facilitator,
mm,
and starting there, and at least like reading some books with that person, um, asking some hard questions, doing some exercises, um, and um, having just a community of people to talk about, like, okay, what are you trying this week? We're not just consumers of information, um, and how do we be a little bit more courageous in having conversations with people who are really different from us about things that matter, um, so that we're not just developing a scene um, of insiders,
Mm.
but that we can get outside of ourselves. How do you talk to your kids and your grandparents and
Yeah.
your neighbors and your not neighbors and your people at your shitty job? How do you talk to everybody
Mm.
about stuff that matters, and then try to move that into more collective spaces of meetings that happen regularly, interrupting normal
Mm.
practices, this sort of micro practices of solidarity and of power shifting. Um, I think that it's so context dependent,
Yeah.
how that looks, and I'm pretty committed to being pretty radically open to that looking um, any kind of way, and taking place in any kind of um, environment. And what looks radical in one place might be totally unproductive or even counterproductive in another place. And what looks like, you know, boring, stupid reform in one place can be totally transformative in another context. Um,
Mm. Yeah.
I think having people with whom you can talk about not just solidarity but power, I think is really important.
Yeah. Cool. I feel like we're naturally arcing towards the end of this conversation. So
Yeah,
I just like to recap real quick some of the things that really stuck out to me were like this idea of setting an intention for a meeting. What do we want this meeting to make? What should be the result of this meeting as the first step for planning a meeting? It's like, oh wow, yeah, that makes so much sense. Uh, to have like a direction and a compass to orient with, and what you just said now, like how do we talk to everyone, no matter their background, about what's important to us and to them, as like a question to carry with me into the future and to hold for a while and see what I find. Feel like really valuable prompts. I don't know if you have any like moments that stuck out to you, or like things you're taking away that you wanna um, recap or share.
I mean, I think it would be really great to find ways to connect activist conversations across
Mm. Yeah.
context. And I'm trying to figure out like how to learn um, from folks in Europe who I think are thinking about things in a different
Mm.
way. A lot of my learning about popular education, most of it comes out of work and reading and discussions that have long-term discussions in Latin America, um, and I think the development of political consciousness is something that my own learning comes mostly from Latin America,
Mm.
and activists there, organizers there, educators, um, and I guess I just want to invite more conversation
Mm.
among activists in different places, and and thinking about what would it be like to struggle in a place that uh, has a relatively strong social safety net
Mm.
and lines of exclusion uh, that are maybe taken for granted,
Hmm.
and that are really complicated, and so people don't want to touch them.
Yeah.
Like, I have lots of future questions for you about, like, what does Islamophobia look like right now in Vienna? Like, what is um, you all have real Nazis,
Yeah.
these days, right?
Yeah.
What does that look like, and who's talking to those folks,
Mm.
and um,
That
where is that energy coming from? And
that's
yeah,
a short answer. No one's talking to them. Yeah, which is really dangerous. But yeah,
yeah,
maybe that's for a future conversation. or
future
or
conversation.
an email or something. I also just, when you just said like
Totally.
you're thinking about like how to connect activist contexts from different regions or like political contexts, and like there were some ideas, and we might have to talk about that also in the future.
Sure.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing all your wisdom and perspective. Find it really, really
Thank
valuable.
you. Good luck at your meeting
Yeah,
tonight.
thanks. I'm feeling good about it. With this briefing, it
Good.
can only be good.
Great. I'd love to hear about it.
All right. Have a great day and see you soon.
You
Bye
too.
bye.
Okay. Bye.